Hey everyone, and welcome to Gaming in the Keats. I am your host, Chate, and today we're starting my series on Abyssal Ruminations. This series is highlighting thought processes on looking at lists and list changes. It could be units and how they function. It can be synergies and combinations with units, and so it can also be a whole variety of topics. You let me know. But I wanted to share this process with you mostly because when I refer to it as abyssal, to me it resembles this almost addictive, cyclical, uh, thought processes where you just kind of get stuck and you're questioning yourself and you're not sure if this works and you haven't had time to really test it, or maybe you've tested it so much where you're just in sort of a writer's block, if you will, of trying to figure out this ever-changing puzzle of your list or list design. So yeah, I figured, why not? Let's make a video about it, and I can share with you at least my process of how I go through this cyclical, ruminatory, if that's a word, endeavor. Okay, so the list I'm focusing on today is the original list I used in my first bat rep. A link to that video will be in the description below of this video. If you haven't seen it, go check it out. I will not be doing any sort of spoilers on how the game went or the results, but I at least wanted to focus on how I'd like to go about changing this list after playing it. Now, keep in mind, I've only used this particular list, or at least this variation of it, once. In the grand scheme of things, I think ideally I want to have at least played with it 5 to 10 times, but again, because of circumstances of this army being in the United States and I'm here in Germany, I don't have that ability, at least to do it in person. So why not? Let's try this thought experiment out anyway on looking at what sort of things I'd like to change. So this list here starts with a Beastmaster Imperious Dragon, great weapon, cleansing light, so divine and flaming attacks, lots of strength, 6 AP3. It has a Rod of Battle to give itself +1 to hit, and the Obsidian Rock for some nice magic resistance too. We then have the Temple Exarch, Warsmith, with paired weapons, Shield Breaker, so AP10 and a Potion of Swiftness. The Exarch will be going into the Spear unit. I usually do it that way because I like making that Spear unit a bit more killy. Then I have Buffy. She's my Vampire Slayer, and in this list, she's a Selixian officer. She's my general with Shield, Kraken's Hide, and Seal of the Republic, so I can get her to a 1-up armor save. The Spear with Mastery of Slaughter allows her to have multiple wounds too, and gives her Artistry of Death as well. So she's always +1 to wound. And she has Seal of the Ninth Fleet, so that allows the unit that she goes into, surprise, it's Judicators, to be Academy trained. Now, rounding out the character section, we have the Warlock Outcast on Witchcraft. When I took it on Witchcraft, I was wanting to try out the new wheel turns to see how that went, and I found it to be a very large deterrent for my opponent to wanting to stop the wheel turns. So I was able to get off other combat-related spells. In core, we have the 32 Selixian Spears with the Executioner icon. We have 11 Corsairs with handbows, where the Warlock Outcast goes into, 2 units of 5 Shadow Riders for Chaff, 27 Judicators with a Flaming Standard, 10 Obsidian Guard to help with some potential panic checks, and team cuddles here with the 2 Krakens. So yes, you'll notice that I don't have a BSB in the list. I'm basically relying on the leadership discipline 10 from the general and the minimize leadership from the Beastmaster for the Krakens, and then the Obsidian card to give me some rerolls in case I need it. When the Exarch goes into the spears, they become frenzied and fearless, so that also prevents them from at least panicking when she's alive. So that being said, that is the original list. And what I liked in this list when I played it, I liked the fact that it had 3 single models, one that flies. I really liked the neat core setup at 1125 exactly. And I liked the 2 dedicated pieces of chaff with the Corsairs acting as a backup just in case things started to get hairy, so to speak. I had essentially five combat threats, with the dragon, 2 Krakens, and then the 2 big units of infantry. And of course I had the discipline 10, which really helped with panic checks or keeping my spear unit from being frenzy baited. What I wanted more of was essentially the list in its current iteration only had 5 spells, so I really wanted 6 spells. I also wanted magic resistance on my infantry blocks because they're the ones who are taking the heat, as they're the units that are going to be scoring me my objectives. Then I also wanted a bit of range damage, to be honest. I wanted to deal with my opponent's chaff and help clear it, and also just put pressure on potentially single models that might be in my opponent's list, or whittling down important units. And then I think the Beastmaster build was rather underwhelming, to be honest. I think on paper it's nice, but then when you think about it, she's still only offense 5, and you have to pay those extra. I mean, I chose to pay those extra 35 points for Rod of Battle to help her out, to make sure she kills things essentially. So I don't know. I'm just not convinced about that particular build. But I think it was a good effort, at least because, again, it gave me divine and flaming attacks, which the flaming attacks can synergize with the alchemy attribute. So I think it was a good effort, at least. So then that leaves us to this question here of what direction do I take? Do I focus on character builds alone? If I liked all the other components of the list, I at least have the core army idea set, and I only need to focus on those small little tweaks in character builds to perhaps redistribute some synergies, or to add that icing on the cake to make the list function how I like it. This method, or at least this direction, I think definitely allows for more consistency when you're playing with a list that you are practicing with, say for a tournament, or just getting used to the army. However, then I can take the other direction and look at the army design. The original army that I used was very close combat oriented, and so I'm wondering, okay, well, if we start to add in more spells or start to add in more range damage, what does that look like in the overall design of the army, and what units do I need to be taking to achieve those goals? So moving forward, speaking of goals, I still want to be able to put immediate pressure on my opponent with this list, and I want to have multiple or diverse threats. So that can be big units of elite infantry, that can be single models, that can be monsters, that can be the potential of having that range damage output. I also want to have magic support for that close combat. That could be very crucial in taking an objective or pushing my opponent off an objective or just killing a unit and picking up points, which definitely, in my opinion, for this list, 6 spells is rather necessary. I think it seems to be 6 spells is the consensus, at least from what I've been hearing and listening to other content creators on the Ninth Age and just players in general. So definitely 6 spells seems to be my go-to there for Magic setup. I still want the 2 to 3 pieces of chaff, again, to make sure my combat units get to where they need to be, and I can ensure those combats that I want. And yeah, I think I will need a bit more shooting to help deal with my opponent's chaff as well. So, in the character builds direction, I'm deciding to change the Beastmaster build, make the build cheaper, go with paired weapon, shield breaker, and a lucky charm. I feel like this build is a bit more consistent because now I have paired weapons and offense 6 on the Beastmaster with 5 attacks, strength 4, but if you consider the +1 to wound and the AP 10, I feel like this build can probably have a bit more consistency overall without needing magic support. I then have the Temple Exarch, roughly the same cost, except this time I gave her the Pride of Gardekos to give her that extra attack, Halberd, AP2, and Divine Attacks because I dropped Cleansing Light on the Beastmaster, so I wanted some Divine Attacks in here. And the Obsidian Rock to give her unit MR2. I kept Buffy's build the same. I didn't change it. I'm sure I could think about changing the Selixian Officer build, but I want to challenge myself a little bit and say, no, this build, I'm fine with it, and I don't need to change it, or at least pick a unit that I don't feel like changing. And so finally, to round out the character section, I have the Outcast of now switching to Cosmology and giving her the Magical Heirloom and Lightning Van Braces. So now she has 4 spells and the Exarch has 2. So I do hit my 6 spell goal here. I chose Cosmology because I wanted the option of not only having Ice and Fire, but Perception of Strength pairs really well with Word of Iron on the dragon, for example. And I liked having, now with the new Truth and Time, having an agility modifier. So I find Cosmology is a bit more offensive than Witchcraft, but I can still use hexes or buffs depending on the situation. So it gives me some more flexibility here. And it makes my opponent have to think a bit harder on which spells to stop versus just really focusing on the wheel turns. So I like having to make tougher decisions for my opponent in this Magic setup here. Now we're looking at the army design approach. So I kept the Beastmaster the same as my character build approach. I really like this build. It's cheap and consistent. However, now we go to my general. So I've made the Exarch my general. I've given her Lacerating Touch and the Obsidian Rock. So now she causes fear, which is nice, and has a bit more damage output. Furthermore, I then dropped Buffy, the Selixian Officer, and now have a BSB in here on Divination. She has 2 Aether Icons to help with the magic resistance. She has the Pride of Gardekos, again for some divine attacks. And now she has the Book of Arcane Mastery, so she can choose 1 out of 4 spells from Divination, aside from being Know Thy Enemy. And we still kept Cosmology as the idea here. We then changed my core setup a little bit. We dropped the spears to only 29, and we added in Silixian auxiliaries to help be a scoring unit in the list, because I still at least wanted 3 scoring, and now I have a bit of anti-chaff. So then you'll notice this change here, actually, the Aether icon on the Judicators. But the massive change is this section here. So now I've added 2 repeater batteries and a unit of black cloaks. So now I'm adding a lot more range damage to help clear units, clearing chaff units, or to put wounds onto single models with just focus firing on one unit, or to whittling down a unit to make them combat ineffective. The black cloaks are there again for a bit of extra poison shooting and to ultimately become chaff probably as well. And so we drop Team Cuddles. You no longer see 2 Krakens in the list, you just see Mr. Cuddles, the Hydra. So at least I still have 2 single models with this one. The Hydra is much more durable than the Krakens and can also deal with infantry a lot better than Krakens can. So I like that, because in all honesty, I think my opponents are going to be trying to avoid the Judicators anyway, and I think Judicators tend to struggle with elite infantry. So the Hydra's there to just get in the way, use breath weapons, maximize thunder stomps with the Beastmaster synergy, of course, and utilize also its self-healing as well if you roll those sweet 6s. So yeah, that's the army designed approach. So the overall changes is, with the army design approach, I now only have 4 dedicated close combat units, but I still have 6 spells, which is nice. I have a lot more range damage. I only have those 2 single models, like I said, and now I have to distribute the unit synergies a bit differently, because the Exarch, my general, would then go into the Judicators instead of the spears, and the BSB goes into the spears ideally. And so the spears then become more of an anchor, they become more of an anvil instead of being an offensive unit. So I wanted to utilize the battle focus from the Exarch and the hatred from the Judicators to make them that much more punchy. So then spell selection, I'm most likely taking Word of Iron and Glory of Gold on the Exarch, Warsmith on the BSB. I believe I have to take the number 1 spell, Know Thy Enemy, and then I'll probably be taking Stars Align as well. And then Cosmology, again, is a bit more situational, because I feel like it's more flexible. If I feel like I don't need Truth in Time, then I'll probably take maybe Altered Sight to help some range damage, or Perception of Strength and Ice and Fire. I think that combo is really nice. So something I also can't forget here is the Hereditary spell. In the character build approach, I get it automatically with the Magical Heirloom. However, with the just army design, or the army redesign, you could say, approach, I might need to take the Hereditary in case I'm going up against, say, like a Sylvan Elf shooting list, because that one will hurt. So having that Hereditary to deter my opponent from trying to put wounds onto units, I think will be really nice, and again makes it tough for my opponent to figure out what spells they may need to stop in terms of close combat or range damage potential. So my concluding thoughts here is going from a skewed to more balanced list. Is that, I guess my question I should say is, like, that's the direction I ended up taking with the army design approach, because I essentially switched it from being a very close combat-oriented army to now having more balance in the list, which makes the list more suitable for, say, singles tournaments. Then there's that question on, the difference between having that discipline 10 and relying on the units, say the Obsidian Guard and the Beastmaster leadership to help keep my units staying, versus using the BSB reroll and going down to a discipline 9. And then again, both approaches, at least currently, still only have 3 scoring, so I think I may struggle on certain objectives, say hold the center, for example, or breakthrough. So it means I'm definitely wanting to be pushing with my scoring units, but because those units are still combat oriented aside from, say, the auxiliaries, I'm happy to do that. Another series of questions here is, which is better? Is cosmology better? Is witchcraft better? Or is evocation better in this conception of the lists? I like evocation. I really do. I like having, say, Whispers of the Veil and rerolls to wound with lethal strikes, so spectral blades. Like, that's really, really nice. But cosmology just gives me a bit more flexibility, and it also gives me more range, so I can spread out a bit more. So that's why I'm really trying out cosmology here. And then another thought here is whether or not it's worth choosing to forgo academy training on the Judicators to instead just give them battle focus to combo with their hatred. So admittedly, with Judicators, from my experience, I found that the academy training rule rarely kicks in, because they're either basically killing what you need them to kill, so it's basically an auto break anyway, or they've had moments of whiffage, and there are certain matchups where they just don't do very well, say against like Swordmasters or Obsidian Guard, and or they get shot to pieces, and so the rule doesn't really come into effect anyway. So I went with something that's a bit more built in and less situational. So yeah, what's your approach? Was this helpful? Was seeing my process, this circling of the abyss, so to speak, or this rumination process, was this helpful for you? Is this similar to what you do after playing multiple games with a single list, or playing one game and saying to yourself, wow, I really didn't like how this list played, or I really didn't like how I played these units. What needs to change? But then again, that kind of is focused on whether or not it's the unit or it's how you play them. So in this case, I decided to focus more on, like, I'm making the assumption that, like, okay, I played the units basically as well as I could have. Or at least admitting that, like, okay, certain units aren't meant to be played this way. Spoiler alert in terms of the battle report. But what would I at least want more? Say I played them correctly anyway, and seeing how to make them more consistent in what they're trying to accomplish. So, yeah. Let me know if this approach is similar to how you think about it, or if I'm in my own world, so to speak, on this one. So that being said, I really appreciate it. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next Abyssal Rumination. Ciao, y'all.